Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
If it weren't for jokers, life would be a lot less interesting.
When it comes to what actually happens in arcade games, especially older ones, it's best not to overthink things too much. Like, how can one eat ghosts when they don't have a physical form? Let's just say we should be thankful that enemies die in such a cartoony, non-realistic fashion in a lot of these early games. If Donkey Kong falling from the skyscraper was shown in a realistic manner at all, we would have a goddamn problem. I'm not exactly giddy at the thought of gorilla brains sprawled out all over the place. That being said, there's one game in particular that would be unimaginably gruesome to witness were it not for the cartoony art style of these games. And it's another classic from Namco.
And no, there's no Gashat for this one. Besides, Isle Del's been Isle dealt with.
No, the game in question is the underground splatdown called Dig Dug. A classic among Namco's early arcade titles, Dig Dug is a game that requires strategy, reflexes, and the good sense not to question things too much. And yeah, we're gonna look at this game and its sequels today. And since I take it upon myself to dig into that extra juicy arcade lore, I'm also gonna bring up a couple spin-offs to boot. Hey, I don't mind getting my hands dirty when I need to excavate some history. Okay, let's start by drilling into the history of Dig Dug's development, including people behind the game. Planning for Dig Dug began in 1981, with the game being designed by Masahisa Ikegami, but he also had help from Shigeru Yokoyama, the creator of Galaga, which, in case you didn't know already by watching my incredibly informative videos, is one of the most successful arcade games in Namco's history. Many of the staff members of the game were colleagues of Yokoyama. Exceptions included the game's main programmers, those being hardware engineer Shigeichi Ishimura, who programmed the game for the Namco Galaga arcade board, Toshio Sakai, and the late Shoichi Fukutani. The late Hiroshi Ono, famously known as Mr. Dotman, counted the sprites for the characters in this game among his many credits. As for the music and sounds, that was handled by composer Yuriko Kano, who lists Dig Dug as her first video game project. In fact, the melody for this game was composed because she couldn't come up with a realistic stepping sound. Which, honestly, isn't surprising. I mean, it couldn't be easy to program a realistic sound of footsteps with the kind of hardware Namco had in the early 80s. Now, the ideas for the game were quite a bit more ambitious than the era could handle. The team originally wanted to include user-generated levels, years before user-generated content became a big thing in games. I can understand why they didn't go through with it, though. As for marketing the game, while Dig Dug is nowadays classified as a maze game, Namco heavily marketed it as a strategic digging game. By contrast nowadays, Minecraft could be considered a creative digging game. Dig Dug was released in Japan in February of 1982, followed by releases in Europe and North America that same April, with Atari getting the American publishing rights. So let's pop a quarter in the slot and start this baby up! So, being an early 80s arcade game, Dig Dug's gameplay is simple. You control Dig Dug, the guy with the white suit, and you dig around all this dirt to destroy all the enemies on screen. There are two types of enemies in the game. For one, you've got the round orange balloons with goggles. These are called pukas, and they just walk around and try to chase you. Then there are the dragon-like Fygars. I've sometimes misread that as Frygar because, well, look at what they do and you can probably understand the confusion. Normally, they will walk around whatever existing tunnel they're in, but every so often they can phase through the dirt towards you. When this happens, you see a ghostly image of their face, so this is referred to as ghosting. So how do you actually kill the enemies and get points? Well...
This is the part where I'm glad that this game is cartoony.
You have two ways to destroy enemies in this game, and both of them are downright gruesome if you think about it. One, if you dig a tunnel underneath one of the rocks, it will fall and crush anything that happens to be underneath it. That includes the enemies, which are crushed to death. You can get bigger points by crushing multiple enemies as well. If you drop 2 or more rocks in the same level, you'll also spawn a fruit item which gives you more bonus points. But if you're not careful, you'll be crushed to death as well. And then, there's the other way. You see, Dig Dug is equipped with a pump. By pressing the button, you can fire it out to the side or up and down. I think you see where this is going here.
DeviantArt strikes again!
Yup, you can kill enemies by inflating them until they burst like balloons. The sprites make it look all cartoony and all that, but the implication is absolutely horrifying. And why are we hurting these creatures again? Once nearly all the enemies are gone, the last remaining enemy will try to escape out of the corner, causing you to miss out on points if they succeed. And can you blame them? They were just minding their own business until this pump-carrying, drill-toting maniac started killing them with that cheery music that only plays when he walks. Well, it's a good thing that this game is cartoony, otherwise it would have caused unbelievable controversy for the absolutely terrifying ways enemies can die in this game. As it was, though, the game was a big success. Not only was it hailed for its presentation both in graphics and sound design, but its gameplay was a big hit with both players and critics. There were as many layers of strategy as there were of dirt, making for a really fun time. There were also all these little touches like how, as I said earlier, the main theme only plays when you're walking, and how the game celebrates when you achieve the high score. And with 256 levels, those who mastered the game could last a long time. And it made some real bank too. In Japan, Dig Dug was the second highest grossing game of the year, surpassed only by another Namco classic, that being Pole Position. And in America, it sold over 22,000 cabinets, making over $46 million, which amounts to nearly $150 million when adjusted for inflation.
Unintentional puns are the best. I regret everything.
Given the success of Dig Dug, it should come as no surprise that it was ported to several home platforms of the era. The first known port was to the Atari 2600, and given the 2600 version of Pac-Man, it should surprise literally 0 people that the 2600 port of Dig Dug was lower quality than the original. Ports to the 5200 and 7800 would gradually increase the quality. As for the most well-known port, that would of course be the Famicom version. Wait, some of you might ask, don't you mean the NES version? And those people probably think it was spelled Berenstein. Yup, this is another example of the Mandela effect. The Famicom port of Dig Dug actually never released outside of Japan, for unknown reasons. As for the port itself, the biggest difference here was the significantly smaller playfield. In this version, the playfield is 192 by 208, as opposed to 224 by 248. As a result, enemies and obstacles were more closely placed to make up for it. Also, the sky is black instead of blue, likely due to the Famicom's smaller palette size. And of course, who could forget Dig Dug showing up in nearly every Namco museum collection? And Xbox Live for good measure. And of course, we gotta talk about the sequels, because this was during the era when sequels weren't afraid to significantly deviate from the original. So yeah, Dig Dug 2. Developed by Namco Development Division 1 on the Super Pac-Man hardware, this sequel was released in Japanese arcades in 1985 and was quite different from the original. Instead of digging through dirt, Dig Dug 2 has players fighting off the monsters on the surface of several small islands. And while Dig Dug himself, who was later renamed Taizo Hori, still has his pump, his other method of killing enemies is even more cruel. See those stakes sticking out of various parts of each island? Taizo is equipped with a jackhammer this time, and when you hammer over a stake, you create a fault line in the ground in the direction you're facing. And if you can use those cracks to split off a chunk of the island, it will sink into the sea and take with it any enemies standing on it. Yeah, as if being inflated to the point of explosion wasn't painful enough, now we're drowning enemies by destroying islands. Yeesh! Are we sure we're not the bad guys here? Funny enough, the arcade version was never officially released in America. Our first exposure to Dig Dug 2 was the NES version from 1989. Remember when arcade ports didn't happen until years after the original arcade release? Now Dig Dug 2 wasn't nearly as successful as the original. That can be attributed to a few things. For one, the timing of the release. 1985 had other big releases such as Gauntlet, Space Harrier, and Gradius, as the arcade industry was just starting to recover. Also, the game itself was a bit more restrictive. The departure from the maze game format of the original wasn't exactly well received, and the lack of the previous game's more free movement was understandably a turnoff. Still, Dig Dug 2 was able to find its way into a few compilations, if fewer than its predecessor. On the other hand, if you want something that expands on the original formula, like most sequels tend to do, your best bet is Dig Dug Arrangement, which was originally part of 1996's Namco Classic Collection Volume 2. I've talked about a couple of these arrangement games in the past, more specifically Pac-Man and Galaga Arrangement, and Dig Dug Arrangement follows the same pattern. You control Taizo by digging underground and trying to destroy enemies using the classic gruesome methods. Of course, what makes this an arrangement, besides the updated visuals and expanded soundtrack, is a wide assortment of new enemies, hazards, and power-ups, along with 2-player co-op. Among the new enemies are aggressive subspecies of pukas and figars, dash-attacking unicorn enemies, explosive robot enemies which can take out other enemies upon being destroyed, imposters of Taizo that can turn his own pump against him, and Odongadon and Jammer enemies from Namco's Cosmo Gang games. As far as new obstacles go, you've got pipes you can't dig through, giant rocks that crush any dirt under them until they hit either said pipes or the ground, and Cosmo Balls that slide in the direction they're pointing until they can no longer change direction. There are also a bunch of new power-ups, like pump items that increase the speed, range, and power of your pump, rods that cause meteors or bullets to rain down from the heavens, a force field for defense, and gourds that either give you a pittance in points, or cause unusual effects around the field. There are 50 levels in all, ranging from typical gardens to a city, a desert, ancient ruins, a tundra, and finally the moon! Among these levels are boss levels, which you need to beat a giant enemy by using exploding robots or other power-ups. This arrangement of Dig Dug was generally well received as a part of the Classic Collection, and was eventually part of the North American exclusive Namco Museum for GameCube, Xbox, and PS2. There's also another game called Dig Dug Arrangement for the Namco Museum Battle Collection for PSP, but that's vastly different. There was also a PC-only game called Dig Dug Deeper, released in 2001. But while the game was licensed by Namco, it was neither developed nor published by Namco. The developers were Creature Labs, and the game was published by Infogrames, whose parent company is now known as Atari SA, the holding company who owns Atari Incorporated. The game is basically a 3D-ification of the classic Dig Dug, with 3D graphics plastered onto the classic 2D gameplay. Nothing really special. However, the next game to talk about, 2005's Dig Dug Digging Strike, does have a few interesting elements. Judging from the title, you can probably figure out what system this game is for. Yes, following the convention of several other DS titles, the subtitle makes it pretty clear. There's even a bit of plot here. Turns out that Taizo is jealous of his son's recent rise to fame, more on that later. Digging Strike combines elements of both the original Dig Dug and Dig Dug 2, where the object of each level is to sink a boss monster into the sea. You do that by jumping into holes in the island, fending off both old and new enemies, and digging underneath giant stakes which will drop and create massive fault lines that will hopefully drop the demons into the drink. There's a wide variety of items to help out Taizo, including power-ups, fossils which unlock bonus stages, parts for weapons, food that can power up enemies if they get their claws on it, and even items that serve as summons if you complete a special minigame based on other Namco properties. While the gameplay is as solid as ever, it is very short, and the last ability of the game is questionable. Oh, by the way, there was also a Dig Dug MMO in Japan. Called Dig Dug Island, it was based on Dig Dug 2's gameplay, and players could customize their own islands. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. It launched in May of 2008, and shut down less than a year later in April of 2009. Oh, that's right! Did you know that Taizo had a son? Yeah, his name is Susumu Hori, and he's the star of his very own series. That would be the Mr. Driller series, which began with the original Mr. Driller, released in 1999 in arcades using Namco System 12 hardware, and later ported to the PlayStation, Dreamcast, and Game Boy Color. Originally, this was planned to be Dig Dug 3, and was intended to be exclusively released on consoles. But producer Hideo Yoshizawa convinced designer Yasuhito Nagaoka to put the game in arcades because he thought it would increase sales. The game was actually completed before it was even pitched. Now let's talk about the game itself. The object is to drill down to the bottom of a series of colored blocks. There are two things you have to be careful of, however. The first is getting crushed by falling blocks. Any blocks that have nothing holding them up will be subject to this little element we call gravity. And given the density of these blocks, you can imagine that a direct impact will have an unfortunate effect on your skull. Interestingly, a falling block will cling to any matching colored block that it falls past, and if it creates a block of 4 squares or more, that block will disappear, potentially causing big chain reactions. You see, that's why you shouldn't dig straight down. Oh, wait, you kinda have to at some point. Anyways, the other thing you have to be careful of is your constantly decreasing air meter. Yeah, you gotta be careful that you don't suffocate. And not only does your air decrease automatically, but there exist dangerous X blocks that not only take more effort to drill through, but they must contain some noxious gases inside, because drilling through one of them will cause you to lose a lot of air. Luckily, there are plenty of capsules to refill your supply. The game was well received for its fun gameplay and its colorful presentation, but it's a game that is best played in short bursts. The game would spawn a whole series of titles in arcades, consoles, and mobile devices, including Mr. Driller 2 in 2000, Drill Spirits on the DS in 2004, and Drill Land in 2002 in Japan for the GameCube, which would later be ported to Switch, PC, and PlayStation 4. While these games would introduce new elements over time, the main foundation remained the same throughout. Okay, so if Taizo is Susumu's dad, then that begs the question, who's the mother? Well, that, my friends, is a whole other can of worms tying into a completely different game. You see, in the Japan-only crossover strategy RPG Namco Cross Capcom, it's revealed that the ex-wife of Taizo is a woman named Masuyo Tobi, nicknamed Kissy. If that name sounds unfamiliar to you, well, let's just say you're far from alone. She's the protagonist of a game called Baraduke, also known as Alien Sector, released in arcades in 1985. Yeah, this game did the whole protagonist is secretly a woman thing over a year before Metroid blew all our minds. Oh, and by the way, this is what Baraduke looks like. Yeah, it's a sci-fi shooter, and it takes place in the same universe as Dig Dug, if you can believe that. And as if that weren't enough, those games take place in the same universe as the Galaxian games.
Yeah, I told you we were digging into a deeper rabbit hole here.
That's right, all these games exist in the same continuity, referred to by Namco as the United Galaxy Space Force timeline, or the UGSF timeline for short. Jeez, why does everything have to have a shared universe, honestly? Anyways, while Taizo and Masuyo were married, they had 3 children, those being the aforementioned Susumu as well as 2 others, but eventually the 2 would divorce. The reason for this has never been clearly stated, but it may be due to Taizo having been a glory hog. Whew! Who would have thought that a classic game like Dig Dug could have so much lore connected to it? Well, I guess that's what happens when companies get creative and try to connect everything together. So, do we call that a retcon? Yes? No? Does it really matter? I don't really think so. I mean, you don't need to be really deep into all this lore to enjoy this arcade classic. You just need its charming presentation and its simple yet challenging gameplay. And Mr. Driller is a lot of fun as well. You just need a solid foundation and some creative ideas to build upon it. And don't be afraid to get your hands dirty.
With all that said, it's important to remember not to take things too seriously. There's a reason cartoons are, well, cartoons. Otherwise, we'd have all sorts of censorship way before Mortal Kombat caused all that controversy. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Blue Sky and Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon, and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.